So it's been a prayerful day, and most of my prayers have centered around asking God to keep my campsite standing despite the terrible weather that I'm camped out in. And in the midst of this elemental chaos, I've decided to film a video to show you how you can storm-proof your base camp irrespective of the weather, and I've had some serious winds coming through here in the past 24 hours. I've also, in the past year, had to replace tent poles. Some of these steel poles have snapped in half because of the high winds that I've had this base camp pitched in. So if you're looking for some advice on how to storm-proof your base camp, you're in the right place. I'm Clarice. Welcome to the Live Ready channel. Once again, special thanks to the Matroosberg Reserve for hosting me in this beautiful snowy weather. The rain came at 3:45 this morning, and the wind came at 7. Now I can deal with any amount of rain. I really don't mind the rain. The problem is the wind. So it's quite a big tent, and the last thing you want is for your tent to actually just be like blowing all over the place. The more your structure moves, the more the frame moves of the tent, the more likely it is that your base camp is actually just going to fall apart. So in a scenario where you want to storm-proof a base camp, your main priority should be maintaining the structure. The reason I'm standing here flipping pancakes so nonchalantly is because I've made a massive effort to keep this base camp standing, knowing the kind of weather that I was going to land up in.
So knowing what an important role the structure of your shelter plays in the rest of the structure remaining standing, I decided that I'm going to concentrate all of my efforts into maintaining the frame of this tent. Now what's happened in the past is I have ended up in high winds with this tent, and the actual frame doesn't get attached to the ground in any way. Hello Junie. Where are you going? Ooh, your pajamas are coming off. The actual frame doesn't get pegged or staked to the ground. It's only the fly sheet of this tent that gets staked to the ground, which is a problem because as soon as the fly sheet catches high winds, then the frame moves separately from the fly sheet. So what I've decided to do is instead to take the storm net that I usually put on top over the fly sheet, and I've put it over the frame and attach it to the frame. So I've got a really secure frame. The other thing I decided to do was to anchor the frame to a really solid object. My roof rack is the ultimate solid mounting point for any piece of equipment. So I decided this time I'm going to mount my base camp tent to my roof rack as well. This proved a worthwhile endeavor because, oh my gosh, nothing wants to open. Everything's like solid. Okay, there we go. So it was really worthwhile anchoring the frame of the tent to the roof rack because then if you think about the forces that you've got when you've got high winds coming at your tent or your shelter, now you've got guy lines that you've used to stake your shelter to the ground, but the guy lines are usually at a 45-degree angle to the force of the wind that's being applied to them. So as effective as guy lines and tent stakes usually are, they're not as effective as a anchor point at the same level or the same direction in which the wind is blowing would be. So for example, my roof rack is just about the same height as the crossbars of this tent, so having anchored the tent to the roof rack means that I'm giving the wind an opposing force in the exact same direction. In other words, when I had really high winds coming at the tent, I had really strong forces opposing the force of the wind on my shelter. Now, if you have a very resistant force, then you're going to get things like guy lines snapping. I've had some of the guy lines actually rip out of the fly sheet before as well. So you need to have some sort of give in that system. So I also used paracord to bolster the guy lines, but in some instances I've used some of the more movable tent stakes. So you get these angled tent stakes and they kind of allow for a bit of movement. So once you introduce a bit of movement and a bit of give into the system, then it's not as likely to snap because the forces are not going to diminish. So you're going to have the same forces, and somewhere something's got to give. So if you've got a tent stake that, for example, has a spring on it, you can use that tent stake to just give that little bit of give. The other thing that I've managed to do is to actually drill some really thick spiral tent stakes into the ground, and I've created really solid anchor points with those spiral tent stakes. Do you want some kitty food, Junie? Can I give you food? Junie's on the fridge. It means she wants her food. Junie, do you want a tuna mouse? Hey? Yeah. So at 3:45 this morning when the rain started, I was lying in bed thinking to myself, okay, so that's rain. Luckily there's no wind yet because it came later. But if any of the anchor points on the fly sheet fail, this entire space over here is then open. The tent itself is separate, so that would remain closed and sealed, but I would then have a whole lot more forces applied to the tent than to the actual fly sheet, because now the fly sheet's gone. So all of these panels would actually go with the fly sheet, which is something that I've seen happen before. So what I sometimes do is I use this as a sort of gazebo. So I omit the tent part, which is behind me, and I just put panels along the sides, which means it becomes one big space, almost like a military tent. What then happens in high winds is, because the fly sheet is the only thing that gets staked down to the ground, is that's the only thing holding this entire structure to the ground. So in order to get the storm net to actually be attached to the ground, because it doesn't have tie-out points or guy lines, I use some of my ratcheting straps or my tie downs that I use for the vehicle's roof rack. So those are actually quite great because they're so strong and because they're already adjustable in their length, and they've got some really decent hooks on them. So that seemed to have worked really well. But make no mistake, the actual frame itself, despite all of that, can still come apart. And one of the first tricks that I learned with maintaining the structure of this tent is to use some nylon rope, or any rope you can use, paracord or whatever, just to tie the actual frame together. Because in winds, especially when there's a fly sheet that's applying forces in different directions as the wind is blowing, the poles actually come apart. So I've learned to use some nylon ropes and an intricate system of trackers, hitches and taut line hitches in order to maintain the structure of the frame. So I tie the frame together once I've assembled it. The other thing that I've done in this particular camp, and it's the first time that I've tried this and it seems to have made a massive difference, is I've used all of 1.5 rolls of duct tape in order to seal the joints where the poles actually fit into one another. What I have found is in high winds, this tent actually it wiggles apart, and once one of those poles get out, there's so much tension on that joint that's keeping it apart. To try and reassemble it in high winds, or even if it's just up, is really difficult. Also, it's a really tall tent. I think it's 2.5 meters high. In other words, I've got to try and do that on a step with a mallet, and it's nearly impossible to get it done, especially one person alone. All right, so I've put duct tape, I've put nylon rope, I've taken some paracord, and I've put up guy lines or extra guy lines. I've also used the paracord to reinforce my current guy lines. So the guy lines that come with this tent are this really plasticky nylon rope, and it has snapped before. Now I have more faith in 550 paracord than I have in this nylon rope. Now my only concern thereafter was that those guy lines would actually pull out of the fly sheet, and the fly sheet would rip and the guy line rips out. In that case, I could easily put a toggle inside the fly sheet, wrap the fly around the toggle, put a little end of the line bow line, make it into a running bow line, and then I can create a new tie-out point onto the fly sheet. The only problem is if that happens in the middle of the night, by the time you realize that that has happened, there's so much damage done, and the fly sheet's probably way on the other side of the tent already. To try and get it back over this really high frame in those kinds of winds, if you're one person, is really difficult. So by all means, prevention is better than cure here. So we really want to have a look at how we set up the structure of our shelter in order to prevent it from coming apart in the first place. Because once it comes apart, you're going to have a really interesting time trying to put it back together. In retrospect, having tied it out to my roof rack, to my vehicle's roof rack, has just given it that much more structural support. So when it was this particular pole that actually snapped, this middle corner pole, and one part of that pole remained behind in the join, in the 4-corner join, and I had a really interesting time trying to get it apart as well. So I'd actually forgotten to take it apart, and upon arriving here at this camp, remembered that I still had this piece of pole sticking into this 4-corner join. I'd gotten a new replacement pole, but I couldn't put the new replacement pole in because the end of the other pole was still stuck in that join. So there was me with a blowtorch on the phone to my dad going, I don't know what to do, I can't get it out, because I tried to get it out before and I couldn't. So I'm sitting there with the blowtorch, and eventually he's like, you're doing the right thing, you're only heating the outside part of the pole. So now there are 2 poles, one stuck inside of the other. You want to heat only the outside one so it releases the inside one, but the inside one had also bent on the inside. So I had to actually put it on a rock, use my mallet, hammer it back into a round shape so that I could pull it out of the 4-corner join. It's quite an interesting exercise. All right, but that aside, I've now got a new pole in here. What caused this pole to break in the first place was I had high winds coming from that side of the tent, and I was perfectly side on to the high winds. I wanted to use the tent as a windbreak for a survival skills course, which it did really well during the day. But during the night, there was so much force being applied by the wind to that side of the tent that it actually warped and bent the entire frame in this direction, and that's what caused the pole to snap. So, considering the wind direction, point number 1, because you cannot provide a full-on windbreak on the one side using something like this without tying it or securing it to something solid, which is why when I knew the wind was coming from this side for this camp, I parked my vehicle on this side. So first of all, the vehicle ends up being a windbreak for my tent, and secondly, I could provide a structural support or a tie-out point for the tent at the same height that the tent frame is. So I've basically this over here, ooh, don't grab that. So this over here is one of my tie-out or my ratcheting straps for the roof rack for my vehicle. I've tied it to that pole, knowing that the wind is going to blow the tent this way. If I manage to prevent the tent from bending that way, I will prevent those poles on that side from breaking and snapping the same way this one did. So it's all just an equation of forces. You're literally just looking at the forces that are being applied to the structure, and you're countering those forces with something that is solid enough but also has enough give in it in order to ensure that your structure doesn't fail.
If you find yourself camped out in a storm, it's also really important to know when to make a call about leaving your camp. In this particular camp, I actually hiked up to a cabin to go and call for help so that a tractor could come and recover my vehicle, because I was up to hip height in snow in some places and I couldn't actually get out. So it's important to know when to make a call about when to leave your camp. Don't leave it too late either. There's no point risking your safety just because you managed to storm-proof your camp. You don't have to prove anything to anyone at the cost of your safety. I hope that you found value in this video and that you've learned a couple of tips and tricks that you can use to storm-proof your base camp should you be camped out in this kind of weather. Remember to hit like and subscribe. Follow me on social media. I post a bit more of the everyday live ready stuff on Instagram. And until the next time, live ready.